Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our latest Sustainability Live. I'm Dom DeVille, Director of Sustainability and Social Impact at the Wine Society.
And I'm Simon Mason, Head of Wine Sustainability at the Wine Society.
Hi, Simon.
Good
We're in the
evening.
same building, but in different parts. Before we start, very important question. What's your drink of choice, Simon, this evening?
Drink of choice this evening is one of Pierre's, actually, one of his Spanish wines, the Viña Zorzal Garnacha, which I think was a wine champion in the last round, and perfect for a very cold evening in Stevenage, I have to say.
Excellent, very snowy one.
Yeah.
So, the topic of today's live, it's all about having a holly jolly greener Christmas. So, obviously, for many of us, Christmas is not a time for holding back. But increasingly, we're all trying to be a little bit more environmentally and socially minded. So, today we're going to be showing some top tips to enjoy your wine more sustainably over the festive period. But before we get into that, a quick recap on why we do these lives and what we've done so far. Sustainability can be a really complex thing. We know this. There's often no hard or fast, right, wrong answer to tackling the environment or climate change or improving people's lives. So we thought we'd use these kinds of forums, have a bit of a conversation, a bit of a discussion about all things related to sustainability and wine. So what are some of the big issues? What are the hot social, environmental, financial topics that we're seeing being discussed around the world in vineyards and wineries, among wine retailers, in conferences, you name it? Why are these things being discussed? Try and break them down, talk about them, explain them as best we can, and perhaps debunk a few myths along the way. This is only the second one we've done, so we're still newbies at it. Any comments, suggestions, welcome. Please be kind. If there's any kind of specific topics that you'd like us to tackle next year, obviously this will be the last one we do before Christmas. Please send in your suggestions in the comments box at any time, or even afterwards if you're listening to even the recording. So now, in our last live, we talked about the impact of glass bottles on climate change. If you still want to listen to that, it's on the Wine Society's Facebook page. Now, we did say at the end of that that we'd continue that debate in our next live, which would have been today. But I'm afraid we've decided to postpone that one till January, not because it's not important, but because there's something a little bit more pressing we want to talk about today: Christmas. Now, one thing that Simon and I are asked a lot, or have been asked a lot, particularly over the last few weeks by colleagues and by members, is what can I do to be a bit more sustainable over Christmas without spoiling the fun, of course. So we thought we'd share a few simple tips and tricks. They won't save the planet on their own, but hopefully will make a bit of a difference. And actually, when it comes to tackling big sustainability issues like climate change or litter in the ocean or modern slavery, whatever it is, and we're hearing a lot about that last one in the news today with these horrific stories of migrants across the channel. But actually, the best thing you can do is just to make small changes in your own life. So let's kick this off. I'm going to start with you, Simon. Hot tip number one. Now, big question people often ask: does the wine you buy for Christmas or any other time actually make a difference? Should people be buying organic or biodynamic, or does that not really matter? What do you think?
I'm afraid there's a short and a long answer to this one. And the short answer is it depends. And the long answer is yes, it can make a significant difference, but it is quite tricky to work out what that difference actually is. So taking the examples that you mentioned, so organic wine. Now, organic is probably the best known certification in wine, partly because it carries across from other foodstuffs generally, so people feel they understand what they're getting. And certainly it does provide assurance for people who want to limit or are concerned about their exposure to artificial chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and fungicides, and so on. But it's not the be all and end all in wine terms. An example of that is that because it is very tricky to grow healthy grapes, even with organic wine, it's necessary to use copper, for example, which is applied to the vines in the form of copper sulfate, which can help to reduce the effects of mildew on the grapes, which is a really big problem for growers. So it's very tightly controlled, the amount of copper that's used, but over time it can build up in soil, which can be, generally speaking, a worse outcome for the environment. You also need to consider that a lot of the organic preparations are perhaps less effective than a synthetic alternative. And that in turn means that producers will need to have more passes through the vineyard with their tractors, which can obviously use more fuel, creating more gas emissions. And also it can cause soil compaction. And this is where the soil gets pressed down and creates a very dense layer. And the issue there is that it means that when rain falls, it doesn't necessarily get absorbed by the soil as you'd want it to do so. It actually can sort of sit on the surface and then run off, which on a slope can cause soil erosion and damage to the vineyards as well.
So it washes your topsoil into the rivers and things like that.
Absolutely that, yeah. So on one hand, organics does have some advantages, but there are downsides. Biodynamics is another certified approach, and that has the potential to make a greater difference, but it still does permit the use of some copper, for example. But also commonly used are natural preparations that are applied to the vines, and the idea there is that you actually strengthen the vine to give it the tools it needs to fight off any of the sort of the fungus or the infections that might afflict it. So vineyards are viewed a bit more holistically. They're sort of better use made of natural cycles, the lunar cycle, for example. And there's a greater focus on biodiversity. So, for example, producers might use bats to control insects within the vineyards. Chickens and sheep can be found quite commonly in the vineyards, where their manure will fertilize the grapes. And horses can quite often be used as well, rather than tractors, because they compact the soil far less. So biodynamics does have a bit more going for it, certainly, I think, in terms of a more overall sustainable approach to making wine. Both of those are quite easy to certify, if that makes sense. There are recognized certifications for each of those, and we do have lists of wines under each of those categories on our website currently. But neither, I think, are the sort of the be all and end all, I have to say.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with the biodynamics, what you're talking about using animals, is this concept of using life to manage life. Introducing certain birds, bats, etc., to control the insects rather than using chemicals. But yeah, as you say, it's not simple, is it? There's pros and cons to both. But it's kind of beyond the certifications. Is there anything else that people could be looking out for in terms of, really kind of progressive sustainability process?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the areas which is growing fastest is an approach called regenerative viticulture, which looks to not just be a sustainable approach, but it actually looks to give back more than it's taking out, I suppose, as a mindset. And it focuses very much on growing healthy soil before you even start growing healthy grapes, I suppose. So there's a big focus around biodiversity, and there's a really important element around climate mitigation, which I'll come on to. But I suppose in some respects it's a little bit reminiscent of biodynamics, but perhaps without the slight air of mysticism that is sort of aligned with that biodynamic approach. And proponents of regenerative viticulture make the point that at whatever level you're producing grapes, so if you're a conventional farmer, already organic or biodynamic, by adopting a more regenerative approach, you can actually make significant gains both for the local environment and further afield. So a few of the practices that might be involved in a regenerative approach is, again, looking at the biodiversity of your site, thinking perhaps beyond the vineyards to the trees you've got around it, but also looking at what's growing under your vines and between your rows. So in a very traditional, conventional vineyard, you might find that you've got very little underneath your vines. It's all very neat. It's probably the picture that some of our members might expect from a vineyard. It's all very pristine and sort of polished. But a regenerative vineyard would look quite scruffy, and the common saying is that one's neighbours think you're probably getting out of business because you can't afford to do your weeding. But actually, the approach is very much that you pick cover crops that can be grown under the vines or between the rows that will help develop your soil. So, for example, if you have got an issue with the soil compaction I was talking about a few minutes ago, you might plant some plants with very long tap roots. So, for example, radishes, which can really dig deep down into the soil and break up those compacted layers. So it's thinking sort of in the round about the problems that you're facing, and then finding a natural solution to solving the problem, and it's essentially building healthier vines. By building healthier vines, you then cut down on the need for spraying, and you kind of create this slightly virtuous circle. The other big point just to mention is around the opportunities for carbon capture, so soil carbon sequestration. So vines in all sort of situations have the opportunity to draw down carbon into the soil. The issue is in many conventional practices that's then released later on in the year. Taking a regenerative approach, predominantly around avoiding tilling your soil or disturbing your soil, you can actually ensure that much more of that carbon remains locked in the soil, which obviously is a big win for all of us, not just in the local area.
Yeah, I read somewhere, and I was talking to a farmer yesterday from Leicestershire who's farming regeneratively, and he said, I don't know if this stat's true or not, I haven't checked it out yet, that soil can hold twice the amount of carbon that all the rainforests and the atmosphere put together. So something I didn't know. So soil's going to
I mean, I think it's a really exciting opportunity, and it's something I know we're looking to dig into in a lot more detail. The issue is that there are so many slightly different regenerative practices, and the climate and the conditions in the kind of the world of wine vary so much. It's quite hard to get a good set of scientific data to kind of prove the point once and for all. But it's an area
that we want to work on. Definitely, Wine Society. So then going back to this, if our members are looking to buy some good, sustainable or more sustainable wines this Christmas, what are some good names to look out for on our website?
So just picking up on the regenerative theme again, so some names of producers who do adopt regenerative practices. There's Reineke in South Africa, who are producing fantastic wines. I believe we've got a Sauvignon Blanc in stock at the moment from them. Tablas Creek in the States, one of the kind of proponents of regenerative viticulture, really interesting, exciting wines. And if ever you want to Google them and have a listen to some of their podcasts, they're absolutely really interesting listens around the subject. And then much more traditionally, actually, in France, Domaine Gobi, which is a name that some sort of long-term Wine Society members might recognise, but a very interesting French producer who would claim that this regenerative viticulture is nothing new and it's been going on for decades, if not centuries, which it's very true. But they take a slightly more kind of traditional approach to regenerative viticulture, but fundamentally the principles are the same. Unfortunately, at the moment, we don't have an easy way of searching for sort of regenerative wines or a catch-all heading of sustainability under the criteria for wines. But this is something that we are working on. And by this time next year, we hope that we will have up and running for members to make choices more easily. Another starting point for this Christmas is to go to the sustainability section on our website. And under that header, we've got a set of links to producers who are looking to make a difference, either in terms of their environmental practices or their social and ethical practices. So, for example, we've got a feature there and some wines from the Symington family estate in Portugal, who are a B Corp, one of only a few B Corps in the world of wine. And they produce a really fantastic organic certified port as well, which would be good for this time of year. Or perhaps look at Villieira in South Africa, who are a really kind of progressive winery, lots of environmental projects that they're running around biodiversity. But they're also accredited with WAITA, which is the South African Ethical Trade Association as well. And they're involved in some really interesting social projects with the local communities. So there is lots to look for, but you do have to work around it, I'm afraid, a little bit at the moment on our website.
Yeah. Good.
So we've talked quite a lot about the wine itself, Dom. I wonder whether there's something that we can look at in terms of the packaging of the wine as well and the impact that has.
Yeah, so I thought I'd mention a couple of top tips around alternate packaging, or perhaps another better term might be a bit, more climate friendly packaging. So why do we want to talk about that? What's wrong with glass? Well, glass is brilliant for the wine, but sadly it's not great for the planet. And I think this surprises a lot of people because people tend to think of glass as being quite a sustainable material. The issue is it takes a huge amount of energy to make glass. It's smelted at something like 1,500 degrees Celsius. So it's a huge amount of energy required to melt it down and make the glass. It's heavy, bulky to transport. It takes up a lot of space. So more fuel is needed to move it around the world. And whilst it's infinitely recyclable, only about 60% of glass is actually recycled. So all that energy to produce it, and actually only around 60 or so percent of it actually gets recycled. So if you want to buy wine in a more climate friendly packaging, some good ones to look out for are bag in box, cans and plastic bottles, just to name three. So these bag in boxes, now I'm going to show a competitor one, but just for illustration, here's a good example of a bag in box. This is from Bib Wines. Now, a box like this is almost 10 times less carbon than an equivalent glass bottle. And so for wines that you're going to drink within 18 months or so, they'll taste just as good as wines from the bottle. So definitely okay for Christmas this year, for sure. Now, the added benefit is also if you don't finish it all that evening, don't worry, the wine's going to stay fresh for up to 6 weeks once open, so plenty of time to enjoy it. And they fit quite neatly in your fridge door if it's a white, so quite handy. The Wine Society also does some boxed wines. If you can see this, here's a lovely fruity Côte de Rhône red from the Jaume family, who've been supplying the Wine Society with wonderful wine since about the 1980s, I think. We also do a white Côte de Gascogne from the Grasser family, which is a lovely light kind of fruity party white from southwest France. Both, incidentally, were recommended by the Times wine critic Jane Quitty, who chose them amongst her sort of top 3 bag and box wines. But I have to say, the challenge with these bag-in boxes, they're not perfect. So from a sustainability perspective, they're not 100% recyclable. The card box, the tap you just put them in your recycling bin. But unfortunately, the bag inside it isn't yet recyclable. So we're going to be launching a trial of more alternative climate-friendly packaging next year. So we're going to be putting lots of our or 6 probably of our most popular wines, both society wines and fine wines, into bag in box. And when we launch that, we will have a recycling partner, so members will be able to take that bag, post it to the recycling partner, and they'll recycle it for you. It's not a perfect system, but until a recyclable bag is invented, it's the best we can do. In terms of other packaging formats, just to quickly mention the cans, we've got single serve cans. They're around 7 times less carbon than bottles. They are, of course, 100% recyclable. You just put them in your recycling bin at home, not a bin on the train, because that ends up or tends to end up in general waste and landfill. And of course, that single serving means you can just have a glass on a Sunday evening or Boxing Day evening if you don't want to open a whole bottle, which can help reduce wastage. I learned the other day that apparently, Simon, in the UK, the average British household wastes 2 glasses of wine a week because we often open these bottles and we only drink half of it. Shocking stat.
I'm interested to know what the spread of that average is, actually, I have to say, because
yeah, not in my house. Yeah,
exactly. Dom, you mentioned plastic a few minutes ago, and listeners might be quite interested in hearing a bit about that, because it's perhaps not necessarily the obvious choice.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and I've got an example here. If you can see this, sorry, the wrong way. So there's a company called Pacamama which makes these flat plastic wine bottles. Now they're 100% recyclable, and they're about 5 times less carbon to produce than glass. They're also much easier to transport because they're lighter, they stack closely together, so you can get more in a crate. Now, the problem with plastic is it's been demonized in the press because we've seen so many images of it in our oceans. And of course, that plastic pollution is terrible, but actually in some applications, it's a really good material to use. So compared to glass, it's much less carbon, takes less resources to transport and recycle. It's 100% recyclable, so it's a good option. And there's some really good examples of these bottles like this already out on the market. A Galopé Normande, for example, it's a fine wine rosé that's come out in flat bottle, and we're so impressed with it. We're going to include these flat plastic bottles in our climate friendly packaging trial next year. So look out for some of our most popular wines also being available, not just in bag and box, but also these flat PET bottles, which will be a great way to reduce our carbon emissions.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that's that on packaging. What have I missed? Yes.
What about? Go on.
Yeah, I think you were going to say it. Lighter glass bottles, right?
Absolutely. So for those people who are going to stick to glass this Christmas, there's still plenty they can do, isn't there? I think
there is. Yeah. So bringing down the weight of bottles can make a huge difference to your carbon footprint. So generally on the market, you can find wines in glass bottles that range from about 380 grams at the lighter end to about 800 grams at the heavier end. Now, providing you don't go too low, sort of below 370, 380 grams for a bottle, because breakages then can increase, there's no reason for wines to be in heavy bottles. It's branding, marketing. It's got nothing to do with quality or the ability of wines to keep. A glass bottle is a glass bottle, whether it's 370 or 800 grams. But obviously, a bottle weighing 400 grams has got much less carbon and is much easier to transport. So we've been doing lots of work at the Wine Society to reduce the weight of our glass bottles. So for every 20 grams, we reduce our full range of still wines. That reduces our emissions by about 100 tons of carbon a year. So it's a big old impact. So we've got about 38 of our own label society wines are already in lightweight bottles that are under sort of 420 grams. So if you want to buy a society wine in a lighter weight bottle, here's a few suggestions. There's even more coming in the new year, but we've got the Society's Sicilian Organic White. There we go. I'm going to sort of go through these fairly quickly, so forgive me, but we've got the Society's English White there, and for another white, we've got the Society's White Burgundy. I think this is our biggest seller, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Sell a ton of that one. And then if you want a red, we've got the Society's Rioja Crianza here, and we've got Society's Montalbano d'Abruzzo. Probably haven't said that correctly. And then we've got the Côte de Rhône. And if you want some exhibition, the Beaujolais exhibitions, they're all in lighter weight bottles as well. So here's a Fleury as an example. So any of those. Now, frustratingly, a bit like the regenerative bit that Simon was talking about earlier, we can't yet put bottle weights on our website, but this is definitely something we want to do, that we're working on. So hoping to have this available at some point next year, so you can easily, search wines by bottle weight. Perhaps we'll see if we can do that, but at least you can look at what the bottle weights are of your favourite wines. So now moving on, what if you want to give a wine related gift? How can you do that more sustainably? So Simon, you've been looking into this sort of sustainable gift giving.
Absolutely, yeah. And there's a few ways to approach it, and one of them is to consider whether giving an experience is perhaps a more sustainable opportunity rather than giving a thing. And so, it might be that there are ways that you can avoid that kind of the consumption aspect, I suppose, around Christmas, while still giving a very generous gift. And as such a generous gift, I would perhaps start off by saying is that perhaps membership of the Wine Society is the ideal gift for any friends of yours who are not currently members.
My brother-in-law, he's getting that for Christmas.
Oh well, fantastic. Well, that's good news. I don't know, Dom. I'm afraid that you'll qualify for the monthly prize draw at the moment. So for anyone who doesn't know, we are offering the chance to win £500 to spend on wines if you do recommend and sign up a member. But I'm afraid, Dom, you may not qualify for that. But it's well worth checking out on our website. So Wine Society membership's one opportunity. Another big area for us is tastings, and viewers may know that we operate a very comprehensive program of in-person events, which are a great opportunity to taste a range of wines and so on, and meet fellow members, which is incredibly fun for us to host, and we get extremely good feedback on those. Over the last couple of years, we've also developed a really comprehensive program of online tastings, which from a sustainability perspective has the advantages of obviously cutting down on travel. So winemakers can join us from wherever they are in the world, and members can dial in and join the event online as well. And that's been further aided by the introduction of some very nice little tasting packs that the tastings team have commissioned for a lot of these events. And these consist of a little cardboard box which is fully recyclable, with a pouch inside that contains a generous tasting sample of the wine. So there's a program of these lined up for next year. The first one is in January with I think it's Lewin Estate in Australia. So that's well worth a look for those who want something that is perhaps a little bit less impactful on the environment. I do have to say at the moment that not all local authorities can recycle these inner pouches. So do check on your local council website to see whether these are recyclable. And again, as with some of the other elements of these alternate packaging formats, we are working to make sure that they are as recyclable as possible going forward. Yeah. So that's quite a nice option, I think, that people might like to consider. Is there anything, Dom, that we should be thinking about if we are wanting to give a bottle of wine? Is there anything we should think about in terms of the gifting and the wrapping there?
Yeah, this is one I'm probably asked the most about. What wrapping paper should I use, or is wrapping paper recyclable? Because we use something like 100 million rolls of wrapping paper a year in this country just for Christmas alone, and the vast majority of that is probably not recyclable, and so it's going to end up in landfill or incineration. So the conventional wrapping paper, the one that you find on, I haven't got an example here, unfortunately, but that sort of plasticky feel wrapping paper that you find on the high street or supermarkets, it's usually not sustainable because it's made from kind of poor quality fiber that's heavily dyed, coated in plastic, and sometimes even decorated with glitter. So that basically makes it impossible to recycle. I think the rule of thumb is if it feels like plastic, if you scrunch it and it goes back to its original shape, chances are it's a mix of plastic and paper, or it's just plastic, or it's just plastic and it's not recyclable. So top tips on what you can use instead. First thing, best thing to do, always use what you've already got. Find fabric, paper, old wrapping paper, old gift bags, gift boxes, whatever you've got in the cupboard, anything that you don't use anymore, whatever's suitable. Give something a second life. Try and repurpose that as wrapping. Secondly, old newspapers. There's often newspapers lurking around our houses. You can pick them up from local shops. Again, this is about reusing something that already exists, so you're not, taking up new resources, creating something new. If all that fails or that doesn't suit, and you want to buy some new wrapping paper, then the best thing you can do is just make sure it's recycled paper. So it's made up from old paper that's been recycled and turned into new paper, and make sure it's also 100% recyclable. And like what Simon was talking about earlier with those pouches, look out for the widely recyclable label. If it's got that on, it means that will be recycled by more than 70% of local councils around the country. And then last tip, avoid glitter or adding anything onto the wrapping paper that's going to make it harder to recycle. So that includes plastic tape as well, which means when it gets to the recyclers, if it's got tape on it, the reprocessing machines find it much harder to recycle that paper. So instead, better to use recyclable paper tape. This brown tape you can find in the shops or online, which can then be recycled along with the paper. So nearly done. Lastly, so when it's all over, last top tip, what then? What about leftovers, Simon? We've all stood there on a Christmas Day night or Boxing Day morning wondering what to do about half-drunk bottles of wine, half-eaten trays of food. What can we do about that?
When you say we've all sat there with our half-drunk bottles of wine, I'll have to take issue with that. But anyway, it's a very valid point, and certainly considering that I think the statistic is that something like 8 to 10% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions relate to food waste. It's certainly something that I think we all do or should be mindful of in our sort of food and drink consumption over Christmas. Luckily, there is quite a lot that can be done. So we do sell in our accessories section a champagne stopper to pop on the top of any sparkling wines where there's some left over, be it champagne or prosecco or cava, whatever you have left. So that works very well for a couple of days. Similarly, a VacuVan pump for still wines works quite nicely to remove the air and help preserve the quality. A nice little tip, actually, if you have got a few glasses of wine left in a bottle of still wine and you happen to have an empty half bottle sitting around, decant what's left into the half bottle so there's less air at the top, seal it up and then pop it in the fridge, even if it's a red wine, and that stores quite nicely for a few days. Do take the reds out well in advance before you drink them again to bring them back up to room temperature, but that's a quite handy tip that I use quite often. If you've only got a few drops left, or there's a little bit of sediment in it, for example, or it's a bit of a random mix of half inches of wine across a selection of bottles, what I tend to do is pop them in an ice cube tray. Really doesn't matter what the mix is, but pop them in an ice cube tray, and then whenever you're making a stock or a gravy or something like that, just break a few off and pop those into the sauce, and that works very nicely and saves opening another bottle as well. And finally, it's really just worth mentioning on the food front, we do have a lot of recipes on our website, and some of them are absolutely fantastic. Some really kind of creative and interesting recipes, lots that could be made with Christmas leftovers. I was having a look earlier today, and there's a really good looking recipe for a Christmas tartiflette, which, given how cold and grim it is outside, I may actually have to make before Christmas. So do have a look on the website for recipes for leftovers as well, and hopefully we can make a little bit of a dent in that 8 to 10% of food waste.
Great. Well, thanks, Simon. I think we need to stop there. We've gone way over time. Sorry about that. Hope it's been useful. Shows us a lot we can do just in our everyday lives without changing too much or spoiling our fun. It's the little things. So we'll be back in the new year with our next live. In the meantime, as I said earlier, if you've got any topics you'd like us to discuss next year, please do send through any suggestions. Other than that, all that remains to say is have a great Christmas and a happy new year. Bye.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.